I'm Barbara Troyer Freimeyer. It's August 12, 2013, and I'm here with 6 of my relatives. We are meeting at the Greencroft Center in Goshen, Indiana, and we're going to present an oral history of Cornelius Troyer and Emma Farver, who were married June 21st, 1880, and their 10 children, who were born between 1881 and 1907. We're leaving this information so future generations will know about them. All of us are grandchildren or great-grandchildren of Cornelius and Emma, and each of us will talk about history from our own perspective. The 10 children were, in order of their age, Ida, Sarah, Jerry, Barbara, Frances, Laura, Orla, Bessie, Milo, and Olive. All had the last name of Troyer. And I am Barbara Troyer Freimeyer. Cornelius and Emma were my grandparents, and Milo Troyer was my father. And now I would like to introduce the others and have them continue to introduce themselves.
I'm Harriet Bontrager Warren. Cornelius and Emma were my grandparents, and Olive Troyer Bontrager was my mother. She was the youngest of the 10.
My name is Geraldine Purdy, and Emma and Cornelius were my great-grandparents, although I never knew them. And my grandmother was Frances Troyer. She was the 5th of the 10 children.
My name is Esther Troyer Schmucker, and my father was Jerry, and I never knew my grandfather, but my grandmother, I see her standing there and working very hard. I know she had a mint patch, and my brother used to weed the mint patch. And I always treasured her because I think she was a great grandmother.
I'm Emma Neal Gannon Cook, and my mother was Bessie. I am with Esther as I treasure our grandmother's work ethic.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Cook Mendenhall. Bessie was my grandmother. Emma Neal is my mom, and I love them both.
I'm Shelley Yoder Griffin. Emma and Cornelius Troyer were my grandparents, and my mother was Frances Troyer Yoder, known by the family as Fanny or Sis.
Again, I'm Jerry Purdy, and Cornelius and Emma were my great-grandparents, and again, Frances Troyer was my grandmother, as my Aunt Shelley said. She was known as Fanny. So first we're going to briefly talk about the people who preceded Cornelius and Emma, that is their ancestors, and how Cornelius and Emma came to LaGrange County, Indiana, where they had their 10 children.
Cornelius was born on October 31st, 1851 in Holmes County, Ohio, and moved to Indiana as a child. Actually, Emma was Cornelius' second wife. On December 27, 1874, he married Fanny E. Schrock. They had one child, Mary Harrietta. Fanny died in 1877, and Mary Harrietta's family took her to Kansas, where she grew up. In 1993, my husband and I took my mother, Olive, to meet that family. On June 21st, 1880, Cornelius married Emma Farver, and they had 10 children. Cornelius died of a heart attack on June 14, 1915. And Emma, who was born on August 30th, 1861, and died February 8, 1949, was left to raise the children. Now Barbara will talk about the relatives who preceded Cornelius.
All of the available information indicates that the earliest ancestors of Cornelius Troyer can be traced to Switzerland. His ancestors were very successful farmers and generally pacifists. And soon after the Reformation, there was dissent among Protestant followers, and Luther placed the church under the supervision of the local government. And some of his contemporaries, like Menno Simon, Jacob Ammon, who would have also been contemporaries of Cornelius Troyer's ancestors, objected to what Luther was doing and to the practice of infant baptism, among other things. At that time, all of these people who did not stay with Luther were called Anabaptists. And other names such as Mennonite, Amish, came a little bit later. But at this point, they all were probably living in pretty much the same community. And they did not want to fight. They did not want to give testimony in court. And they definitely didn't want to give money and goods to the military. So they were increasingly pressured and harassed in the areas where they lived close to Bern, Switzerland. Because of this, many of them moved on to Germany, to the southwestern part of Germany, the Palatinate region, and Alsace-Lorraine, which borders on France. And some of them that belonged to these early communities were persecuted to the point of even being killed for their beliefs. And so moving to Germany seemed to make sense. But the same problem existed in Germany. They were pressured to be more a part of the community, and they didn't want to be. So when William Penn came along in the late 1600s and offered land in America, many of them chose to leave. There are some extended family members that still live in Switzerland, and the spelling of their name is not Troyer, but it's the more like the original spelling, D-R-E-I-E-R, Dreyer. And the one immigrant that we can apparently trace our lineage to was a David Michael Troyer, and he was listed on as arriving on a ship in 1733 that came to Philadelphia. He was probably about 9 years old, so he was actually born in Germany and probably left many of his relatives back there, but many of them came to America, and he went with a stepfather to what is now Berks County, Pennsylvania. And he and a brother were listed in 1752 as members of the congregation of the North Kill Amish Church, which was the first Amish congregation in America. North Kill refers to a stream that goes through the north part of Berks County. By 1790, this David Michael Troyer was listed as the head of a family in Somerset County. And back at that point, some of the county lines changed and the names changed, and today what is Berks County, Pennsylvania, and Somerset County is a little different than it was back then, but it's close enough that they could trace this family. And they continued, after they had moved to these places, to be persecuted by being fined because they wouldn't help with the revolution. So sometimes their possessions were confiscated, and they were just felt as though they couldn't stay there anymore, and so they continued moving on west, eventually to Ohio. This David Michael Troyer had 13 children, and 4 of his children married children of a neighbor by the name of Jacob Hochstetler. And this Jacob Hochstetler is quite renowned among the Amish Mennonite communities even today, because he refused to let his teenage sons use their guns to defend the family home from an Indian attack. The Indians burned the house, killed his wife and a daughter, and took him and 3 sons captive. They all got away eventually, but his belief in thou shalt not kill was strong enough to keep him from doing any kind of shooting of anything but wild animals for eating. And I had an opportunity recently to visit the site of his homestead, and there is a plaque there that says North Kill Amish Community, and it was interesting to see that even left today. Jacob Hochstetler had several children who escaped the Indian attack, and one of them was a daughter, Barbara, who married a Christian Stutzman. This is the beginning of the big Hochstetler family history book, and part of Cornelius Troyer's paternal line comes through this daughter. Another one of the sons married a lady by the name of Maria Reichenbach, and yet another part of the paternal line for Cornelius Troyer comes from that. And another son married a Maria Kaufman. His name was Joseph, and some of the maternal line for the Cornelius Troyer family comes from that connection. And then these families eventually left Pennsylvania, moved to Holmes County, Ohio, and then some of their children and grandchildren moved on to Indiana, no doubt influenced by tales of rich land even further to the west. Some of the family records give personal sketches of some of these ancestors, and one by the name of John Troyer, who would have been a great-grandfather of Cornelius, is characterized as one of the first Amish settlers in Holmes County, an honorable, hardworking farmer. He had 6 children, among whom was Samuel, Cornelius's grandfather. And Samuel learned to read and write German, was 12 when his parents moved to Ohio, and with his first wife, he had 7 children, the oldest of whom was Jeremiah, who would be Cornelius's father. Cornelius's mother died early. Samuel remarried and had 4 more children. The second wife also died, and he married for a 3rd time, and from this marriage he had 8 more children for a total of 19. For some time, he lived in LaGrange County, Indiana, which was then a wilderness, complete with deer, turkey, and wolves. And then when he was older, he moved to Miami County, Indiana, and spent the rest of his life there. His oldest son, Jeremiah, grew up in LaGrange County, went back to Ohio to find her wife, and her maiden name was also Troyer. Her name was Maria Troyer, so that doubled the Troyer line. They lived in Ohio for a while, then moved back to Indiana when their oldest son, Cornelius, was 12. Jeremiah was also characterized as a hardworking, honorable farmer, and he and his wife Maria had 14 children, and Cornelius was the oldest. On the maternal side, Cornelius' grandfather, Joseph Troyer, is listed as having been born in Union County, Pennsylvania, and his wife, Maria Hochstetler, was also born there, and their daughter, Maria, was Cornelius' mother. And so that line is where the double Troyer line starts in.
On the other side of the family, Emma was a Farver. The Farver origins were in the Alsace-Lorraine region of France. The name spelling was F-A-V-R-E. After the persecution of the Huguenots by the Catholics, the Farver family migrated to the German Rhineland, where the German spelling of their name, F-A-B-E-R, occurred. Early records indicate the Farver family sailing on a vessel named I'll start that sentence again. Early records indicate the Farver family, sailing on a vessel named Minerva, arrived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on October 29, 1767. There were 3 brothers, along with their father, Valentine, on board the ship. They settled in Loudoun County, Virginia. The oldest brother, assumed to be named Valentine Farver, Jr., did not care for Virginia and signed on to a ship bound for South America. He was never heard from again. The other 2 brothers, Christian and Jacob, stayed in Virginia. Christian, born approximately 1745 and died approximately 1814, served under George Washington during the Revolutionary War. He was a weaver by trade who married a widow, Susanna Martin Embrick. She was born September 29, 1751, and died February 23, 1831. They were married in about 1780. They lived in Loudoun County, Virginia. A son, William, was born in 1782, and then Jacob in 1785. At some point, there was a migration to Somerset County, Pennsylvania. It was here that a 3rd son, John, was born in 1791. Jacob, the younger brother of Christian, lived in either Washington or Frederick County, Maryland. His sons were John, who settled in Ashland County, Ohio in 1817, Samuel, who settled in Mercer County, Pennsylvania, following service in the War of 1812, and George, who settled in Miami County, Ohio, about 1830. Christian's sons, William and John, and their mother migrated to Holmes County, Ohio in 1815. John had been in the area the previous fall, purchased land, and built a cabin where they lived. Christian had intended to migrate to Ohio, but he first wanted to return to Virginia. Whether to tend to business or see relatives, no one was certain. He was never heard from after he began his journey east. The descendants from this point on will be in a direct line. John Farver Sr., the youngest son, born August 4th, 1791, and died March 7th, 1862, married Elizabeth Roop Tope, who was born September 4th, 1795, and died April 14th, 1878. They were married on November 3rd, 1816. They raised 12 of 13 children on 160 acres in Holmes County, Ohio. One child, the first Abraham, died at 11 days of age. When twin sons were born later, they chose to name one of them Abraham. Abraham Farver, born March 12, 1828, died December 26, 1893, married Harriet Snyder, who was born February 1st, 1831, and died in 1874. They were married on May 24th, 1855. About 1858, a home was built in Holmes County, Ohio. It was a well-built house and continued to be occupied well into the 1950s. Between 1850 and 1870, a period of migration occurred from Ohio to Indiana and Illinois. Land acreage was desired, and it was now a more civilized area in the West. Abraham walked 225 miles to LaGrange County, Indiana, and chose land in Newberry Township, southeast of Shipshewana. He walked back to Ohio to make preparations to move his family to Indiana. He and Harriet loaded their belongings and 4 children on a train in Millersburg, Ohio, and in 1863 began their residence in Indiana. A house and barn were built and land was cleared for farming. About 1868-1869, the Farver School was built across the road by Abraham and his young sons, Jonathan and William. Abraham and Harriet had 6 children. Elizabeth was born November 18, 1855, and died September 15, 1938. She married William Engel on June 10, 1881. She divorced her husband, who had an alcohol addiction, and moved to Middlebury, Indiana with a son to be nearer her brothers and sisters. Crippling arthritis left her unable to care for herself, and she entered a facility in Illinois for care. While there, she fell, broke both legs, and was unable to recover. She never walked again, but it is said she was a very cheerful person. Jonathan, who was born June 6, 1857, and died October 5, 1944, married Catherine Weaver on March 12, 1882. In 1888, he and his brother William secured land on the east side of what was to become Shipshewana and built a lumber company, which opened in 1889. Jonathan was in charge of the business end, while William headed up the wood and supply end of the business. The brothers built most large buildings and schoolhouses within a radius of 50 miles. The lumber company is said to be the oldest business in LaGrange County. Jonathan also helped build a corduroy road, which later became US 20. The corduroy road involved cutting logs and laying them crosswise in a pattern so that travel could be done over the wooden structure. William Farver, born February 27, 1860, died February 16, 1906, was a partner in the lumber business with his brother Jonathan. He never married and lived with his brother and family. Emma Farver, who was born August 30, 1861, and died February 8, 1949, married Cornelius Troyer, who was born October 31st, 1851, and died June 14th, 1915. They were married on June 21st, 1880. She grew up in Indiana and raised her family of 10 children there. Barbara Farber was born November 21st, 1864, and died July 18th, 1940. Married George Renner on June 3rd, 1888. This couple returned to Holmes County, Ohio, and lived and worked there. Moses Farber, born November 26, 1866, and died June 29, 1951, married Mary Elizabeth Hostetler on November 6, 1887. Mose chose the field of medicine. He taught school for several years before attending Baltimore Medical College, now the University of Maryland. He practiced in Middlebury, Indiana, starting with horse and buggy visits, as well as horseback rides for house calls, prior to using the automobile and having an office. He was well known and a very community-minded individual.
Now what we'd like to do is talk about what we remember about Cornelius, Emma, and each of the 10 children. None of us were alive when Cornelius died, so we'll be sharing stories that we've heard about him. And Barbara will go first.
Okay, according to an article that was written at the time of Cornelius' death, it said that there were 70 automobiles and 217 horse-drawn rigs in the funeral line. The article says that Mr. Troyer was one of the leading men of Newberry Township in LaGrange County, Indiana, and he had a large acquaintance throughout the western part of the county and Elkhart County, Indiana as well. He was not only a successful farmer, but was prominent and influential in public affairs. He held the position of township assessor and was postmaster at Shipshewana for nearly 4 years. But in a larger way than his success as a farmer and his prominence in public affairs, he made an appeal to the goodwill of all he met as a man of character and capacity as a natural leader, one who could be trusted implicitly. It was but fitting as a tribute to his life that his funeral should be one of the largest ever held in LaGrange County, Indiana.
I would add that he was an inventor, an entrepreneur. It's evidenced by some of his descendants. He owned the land the present-day Shipshewana auction barn occupies, and he and several of his contemporaries started a weekly animal auction. He drove around the countryside collecting animals for the auction and also shipped livestock to Buffalo, New York. He accompanied the animals on the train trip there to ensure that they had food and water and would arrive in prime condition. At his farm, he created a conveyor-type system for hauling manure out of the barns and developed a network of pipes to deliver water to each animal's stall so that the water would not have to be hauled by hand. He and Emma were charter members of the Shore Mennonite Church. Remember, all of this was in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In her later years, my mother chose to write several stories down about memories that she had, and this one is called My Father. My father was a kind and gentle man. He was almost 56 years old when I was born, so to me, he was always old. I was his little girl. He had a heart condition which kept him from doing heavy farm work. So he had more time to do things around the buildings, and here I could tag along. In summertime, when the day's work was done, and we all sat on the porch steps where it was cooler, I would somehow wiggle onto my father's lap. I was always welcome there. In the wintertime, I remember how nice and warm and cozy I felt when Father would hold me with his long white beard brushing against my face. Since Father couldn't farm, he became a cattle buyer. For some years, he would own the stockyards in Shipshewana. The cattle and hogs, sometimes sheep, would be shipped east to Cleveland, or most often to Buffalo. When he accompanied the load, which had to be unloaded, fed, and watered at least once on the trip, he would be gone about a week. When he returned, we would listen to him telling about the big city, the sights, and the tall buildings, the people he met, which seemed much different in their dealings and their ways of life. This stirred our imagination and gave us a longing to see the outside world for ourselves. Father seldom failed to bring home a trinket, And sometimes he even brought home a bag of oranges. In the wintertime, when Father traveled throughout the countryside to buy livestock, he would wear a big black bear fur coat. He drove a horse hitched to a topless buggy. Seeing him coming home, unhitch his horse and put him in the barn and come to the house, I could hardly wait. He never failed to have something in his big overcoat pocket for me. It was often just a piece of peppermint candy, but he had thought of me. One night in June, Father suffered severe chest pains. Mother wanted him to stay home, but he felt he had to attend to some business in town. Early in the afternoon, we had a telephone call saying Father collapsed while standing by the hitching rack talking to a friend. They said to bring Mother and me to town immediately. She had a Model T car in which my brother drove us to town. A friend in town owned a Rhea car. They put Father and Mother into the back seat, and I sat in front with the driver. I can see the car yet. It had leather straps from the top of the car fastened to the front fenders. No doors in front, but doors in the back. Father was brought into the house and put to bed. He talked to all of us, and that evening at supper time he died. My father died. I was heartbroken. While the rest of the family were inside, I was standing on the porch with my arms around the banister post, looking into the sky, crying, "Papa, come back! Papa, come back!" Then I realized I would never feel the warmth of his body or the hairy cheek against mine. The next few days were confusion. I don't remember anyone trying to comfort me. I am sure the family did, but I wandered outdoors by myself, my little dog following me. I sat on the porch steps by myself, my dog snuggled against me. He laid his head in my lap to comfort me. I was in my world alone when something made me look up. There seemed to be a dozen faces in the doorway looking at me. All my privacy, all my dignity was torn from me. They pitied me. I got up, my dog following me, and went behind the house into the orchard where no one could see my grief. The day of the funeral arrived. Few people had cars, so we went by horse and buggy. I remember watching the fringes on the buggy top swaying in the breeze. I remember the narrow road where we passed between high bushes and followed the big black hearse. Quoting from the LaGrange County Standard, June 17, 1915, 70 automobiles and 217 horses were in line of the funeral cortege for Troyer. But in a larger way than his success as a farmer and his prominence in public affairs, he made an appeal to the goodwill of all he met as a man of character and capacity, a natural leader. His neighbors turned to him as a father for counsel and help. It was fitting as a tribute to his life that his funeral should be one of the largest ever held in the county of LaGrange.
Okay, now we'd like to turn to Emma, who was born August 13, 1864, and died February 8, 1949. She lived for 34 years after Cornelius died. And I've been told that she had 4 of the youngest children at home when he died to raise and a farm to run. And that was unusual for a woman in that time to take on that kind of responsibility and never marry again. And remember, in those days, you had to farm to eat because you raised your own food. So now let's hear what people know about Emma Troyer.
As I remember my grandmother, she was a very hard worker, and I think of her home, it was always so tidy, everything in its place, and she kept things going that way. She was also very, very frugal. I remember in cooking, one of the things that I recall was that when she would butcher a chicken, that she cooked all parts of it, even down to cleaning out the egg bag and eating that. And people can make fun of it, but it was pretty good. And those little eggs that had never been encased in a shell were very good. My grandmother's greeting, one of them, she was never a hugger. And one of her greetings, as I walked in the door, she looked at me and she said, "My," and she clicked her tongue. She said, "But you have big feet." Well, that stuck with me, and I know there were other greetings, but that really stuck with me for a long time. I remember when we'd have dinners at Grandma Troyer's, and the adults would be at the table, and there wasn't enough room with all of the kids there, so we would sit on the steps. And I can recall my Uncle Jerry really could pray. And he would pray and pray and pray. Well, meanwhile, we would get a little bit antsy and we'd start giggling. Well, by the time the prayer was over, we were in really big trouble. Another thing I remember about Grandma Troyer, the fun times, is going up there. In the springtime, the men would go out and tap the maple trees, and they'd collect that sap. And then a bunch of the family would get together one day, and they would put the sap in big, big kettles and cook that and down until we had maple syrup. And it was so good. I also remember the days that we would go out there, and one day they would butcher the hogs, make their sausage, they butchered the beef, and then the family would all have meat to eat. I also remember one day going up to my Grandma Troyer's, and lo and behold, there's a snake that's hanging on the fence. Well, it was one that she found in the corn barrel, and she had killed that snake, and she was so proud of it. As a child, I kind of thought I'd like a hug from Grandma or something like that, which didn't take place. But you know, as I got older, my respect has grown so for her. To think that that lady was left with those children to raise. She was able to have a successful farm. She had a new home built and took such good care of it. She really is someone to idolize for all of the things that she did. I wish I had known my grandfather, but he died much before I was born. But as long as I live, I will have really fond memories of my grandmother.
I remember my grandmother too as a big, strong lady. And I don't know how old I was, but I know I really learned to know her and to love her too. I remember she had a mint patch that she had south of her, or north of her house, and my brother would go and weed the mint patch. I don't know whether she had any other land or not. I think there was a mint still right close to, but I don't remember whether she had anything to do with that. Does anybody else know that? Mm-mm. Yeah, there was a mint still right close, and I remember smelling all that mint when they were doing that. And so I always remembered her as a big, strong lady.
Just in case anybody is able to hear a cricket, we brought one in to just add a little flavor to the afternoon, and it seems to be a resident of the window well outside of the room here. My memories of Emma are somewhat limited because I was only 8 years old when she died, but my mother and father and I visited her, I think, every Sunday as long as I lived, from birth up until 8 years old, but I'm sure it wasn't every Sunday. But that was the ritual. We went to church, and then we took dinner to her on Sunday noon and ate dinner with her. And my memories of her are of a very sort of taciturn, stoic lady, not a big conversationalist, not a person that was a jokester, but very, very serious, and she was still working hard when I was a small child, and I can remember that my dad was very unhappy with her one Sunday when we went, and she reported that she had fixed all the fence for about a quarter of a mile in this one field, and she wasn't supposed to do that anymore, but she was tired of waiting for somebody else to do it for her. My favorite recollection was her waiting to gather eggs until I would get there, and then she and I would go with a basket out to the hen house, and I got to get the eggs out from under some nasty little hens that liked to peck at me, but it was still a great treat, and I enjoyed doing that. And I can recall she had a quilting frame that was up in her living room most of the time, and sometimes she would be knitting, and I was completely fascinated by the way she knit mittens because she used several needles, and I thought that was really intriguing, and she would knit for me so that I could watch her. I never learned how to knit from her, but it was fun watching her. And when she was very ill, and she was not ill very long before she died, but she was in bed for several days, and we visited shortly before her death, and she asked me to come into the bedroom, and I can remember that she took my hand and she said, "Now behave dich," which means behave yourself in Dutch. And then she told me to leave the room because she was tired and she wanted to just sleep a little bit. And that was the last conversation that I ever had with her. And as I said, I was 8 when she died. And she had, before she died, said that a flax wheel, a spinning wheel, that she had from her family, from the Farver side of the family, could come to our family. And I do have that spinning wheel, and I treasure it. Just one funny little memory, because she was surrounded by Amish families who had no telephones, and she had a telephone. The Amish neighbors would come and use the phone not only for local calls, but for long-distance calls to friends and family in Kansas and wherever. And I can remember her talking about this, and she wasn't whining and complaining. She just was saying that this was getting to be a little bit of a problem. And then one time I noticed that she had a little coin box beside the telephone, and had that there for the Amish neighbors to put in some money to help pay the phone bills. And also, we should probably add that when Cornelius married Emma, he no longer stayed Amish because she was not Amish, she was German Lutheran. And so they compromised, I guess, and helped start Shore Mennonite Church. But they all spoke Dutch, and it would have been hard, I think, to tell the difference between the Amish families and the way they lived. My memories of her are always wearing a long dress with an apron with a small top that she pinned on with straight pins. And she had her hair done very plainly and pulled back. She didn't wear a covering or a bonnet of any kind, but her dress would have fitted right in with all of the neighbors.
Cornelius Troyer and his first wife, Fanny Schrock, had a daughter, Mary Harrietta, who was raised by her maternal grandparents in Kansas with some help and contact from Cornelius's brother, Mose. She married Jonathan Miller in 1894, and they had 12 children. They range in location anywhere from Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. I believe there's some in Texas, and even further west and south. But they are quite a group. They are no longer Amish, and most of them are not Amish, maybe several. And they try to get a family reunion going for all the descendants and grandchildren every few years or so.
Okay, so now we want to turn to talking about each of the 10 children. The first of who was Ida, and Esther will be talking about Ida. Most of us do not remember her.
About the only thing I remember about Ida was I remember a family gathering of some kind, and they had a child. I think it was their child, wasn't it? Was born disabled, and on the picture, she was in the front, sitting down, and had the biggest smile on her face. And that's what I remember about Ida.
I do not remember Ida, but I was acquainted with some of her children. She and Almond Hostetler had 7 children, and they had quite a few children of their own. Mary was mentally disabled, and as an adult, she lived with another sister in her family for her entire life. And Elsie and Nidra were sisters that we seemed to see quite often. They lived at Greencroft for a while, and they were people with whom we visited. Sarah was married to Daniel Kaufman. She died following complications from childbirth, and she had one son, Elvin Kaufman, who married and had 2 children, Sarah Romaine and James Levon. None of us were around to remember Sarah.
Okay, so the third of the 10 children was Jerry, and his daughter Esther is going to be talking first about him.
Well, I don't know too awfully much about his growing up, but I know that he was postmaster for Shipshewana for some years, and I have a picture, but my son has all the pictures that I might have brought today, so I don't have it. But I can say that my dad was the most kind guy you ever would meet. He'd take his shirt off to help somebody. He was a builder. He didn't farm, but we did have 10 acres. And we had a pasture, and we always had a cow. And my mother would go out on a cold winter week and milk the cow because my dad didn't. Yeah, and yeah, he built quite a few things. In the construction, I don't remember what all, but he built the little barn. And if you go to Shipshewana, the barn is still there, 1.5 miles south of Shipshewana. So every time we go by there, I can have fond memories. The house is gone that I was born in. Well, there were 7 of us that grew up. I think the second baby, Ines was the first, and then a baby boy was born, but he died, I guess, when he was about 9 months old, as I remember being told. And then there were 8 of us with that, the baby boy, but 7 of us grew up in adulthood. And it was Ines and Dorothy, and then Francis, and then me, and then Rachel, and Genevieve and Maxine. Maxine and I are the only ones that are. Is it Maxine I or Maxine me? I? I wondered what that, there was some confusion about that. But yes. And she lives in Pennsylvania, close to, well, it's about 50 miles from Philadelphia down. It's close to Souderton, if you know about it's eastern Pennsylvania. I don't get to see her very often anymore, but her husband died about 5 years ago, and so she is living in a a retirement home, too. So, but we don't get to see each other very often anymore. About the only thing I can remember, I don't think we celebrated birthdays, but I don't know whether it was Christmas or not, but I think that my folks bought a little baby doll for all of us girls. And but I think, I don't know what the occasion was or anything like that, but we shared that baby doll. During the Depression, he didn't have work, so in construction. So he drove a semi truck from Chicago to Cleveland, I think it was, a big semi. And I can tell you, I saw my mother with tears in her every time he left. Yeah, so I know she missed him.
Well, I have some distinct memories of Uncle Jerry and Aunt Lizzie when they lived at the place that Esther was describing just after you turn off of US 20 onto State Road 5 to go into Shipshewana. House and barn sat right there between 20 and the town of Shipshewana. And we would, as a child, every Sunday we went visiting to my grandmother, and then usually we hit a few other brothers or sisters of my dad, and Uncle Jerry and Aunt Lizzie were people that we often visited. And I have no brothers and sisters, and all of the children of his were grown up and gone, and so usually when we went, it was just me as the only child, and I was required to sit and listen to conversations that didn't excite me a bit. And as I recall, my dad and Uncle Jerry argued with each other, not viciously, but they politically had wide differences, and they discussed somewhat animatedly sometimes all of their particular views, and once in a while they just would revert to Dutch if they needed to. A lot of times Aunt Lizzie would rescue me after I had had to sit for what seemed like an eternity. She would ask me if I'd like to come out to the kitchen and have a glass of water or a cookie, and I always was very eager to get to do that. And sometimes I could go outside, out through the back door and out into the yard for a little while, but I just definitely recall my dad and Uncle Jerry spending a lot of time talking. I don't recall Aunt Lizzie saying anything, nor my mother, just the two of them. And I would have to concur that Uncle Jerry really was a very kind person, a great carpenter, and my dad worked for him a lot and learned most of his construction and carpentering skills from his brother Jerry.
I did not know Uncle Jerry real well. Most of his grandchildren, a lot of them were around my age, and occasionally we'd get together and have a good time. I do know that Uncle Jerry and perhaps his brothers built the gym floor in the original LaGrange, Indiana High School in 1928. And he also was responsible for putting in the street lamps in LaGrange and building Nasby Dam, which is in LaGrange County on the Pigeon River between Ontario and Mongo. And still stands. The high school gym was torn down, but these others are still representative of the work that he could do. The memory I have most of being at Uncle Jerry and Aunt Lizzie's house was after the death of Uncle Jerry, and they had the calling at the house. And I know that we children were stuck inside the house for quite a while. It was either too cold or too rainy to go outside. and it was in the evening, and we tried to have quiet games of tag and a few other things, and the adults got very unhappy with us, and we had to sit after that.
I remember that Uncle Jerry was responsible for building our home on Cassopolis Street in Elkhart. And as I understand, he also built the home that Grandma Troyer, the new home that Grandma Troyer lived in.
The next child, the fourth child, was Barbara. So we'll now talk about the memories of her.
Aunt Barbara was a lovely, sweet, gentle lady. At one point when I was very young, my father was in the hospital, in Hines Hospital in Illinois, and my mother went to work for my father's brother-in-law and his wife, and I could not be with my mother. So for several months I lived with Aunt Barbara and Uncle Ed, and it sounds like a sad time for a child to be away from their parents, but it really was a wonderful time. Aunt Barbara would wake me in the morning saying, "Rise, rise, you sleepyhead, lie no longer there in bed. The sun's been up an hour ago, and you should welcome him, you know." And I would jump out of bed, get dressed, grab my cup, and run for the barn, and Uncle Ed would give me a cup of milk. He had just been milking. And coming in, and then we'd have these big breakfasts with the eggs and the home-cured ham, and it was a wonderful place to be. I can remember my father and Uncle Ed going hunting, and I can still to this day see them walking up the hill behind the barn with carrying their guns, and then they'd come home with the rabbits or the squirrels, and we'd have a big feast. I will, as long as I live, I will treasure my time there. They even said they gave me a cow. And I named the cow after my mother. I named it Bessie. But when I left to go back home, they did not let me take the cow with me. I think that they were Mennonite. And I remember when Aunt Barbara died. She died the day that President Eisenhower was being inaugurated. And shortly before she passed away, she was laughing about him being in the car with no top and his bald head, and she was sure he was going to catch pneumonia. And then she had a heart attack and died.
I have some vivid memories of Aunt Barbara and Uncle Ed, and again the non-ending Sunday visiting, and we would come to visit them, and they lived in the town of LaGrange, Indiana, part of the time, and then they also had lived out in the country west of the town of LaGrange. But I remember mostly when they lived in town, and I think that was when they were a little bit older. And Uncle Ed was very fascinating to me because he was missing a finger. He had injured his finger and gotten gangrene, and they had had to cut his finger off. And I was totally impressed with the fact that he had a stub for one finger. That I always had to have him tell me about that, and when we visited. And Aunt Barbara, my memories of her were that she was a very quiet person, but very kindly and very nice. And I seem to recall that they never had very much by way of money or of very many possessions. They seem to have suffered a variety of bad luck, I guess you'd call it, one way or the other. But they had a nice little house, and I always enjoyed as much as I could getting to sit and listen to them visit about a variety of things. So
I only knew Aunt Barbara and Uncle Ed when they did live in LaGrange, and I remember visiting their house, visiting them there. I do not remember a whole lot about them. They had one son, Venice, who was a great deal older, and he had 6 children, and one of the boys used to bring his mother, who'd been Venice's wife, to our cousin's breakfasts for a few years until she wasn't able to do so anymore. What I do remember a story that my older half-brother Dave stayed at their house. They evidently kept lots of nieces and nephews for periods of times that when they were needed, and that he was unhappy about something. He was sitting on a porch swing, and he raised himself clear up to the top of the porch roof by moving the chain up one side at a time, one link at a time. Now he was clear up at the top there by himself.
The next child was Frances, or commonly called Franny, and she was my grandmother, and I have a lot to say about her. But she had 3 children. One was Shelley, my aunt, who is here today, and 2 other children, my mother, Carol, who is deceased, and another brother, Troy, who is deceased. So I'll let my Aunt Shelley talk first.
I hardly know where to begin when I talk about my mother. She was a very unusual person. She was a feminist before the term was ever coined, and we're talking about the beginning of the century. And she believed that a woman could do anything she wanted to do if she just worked at it, and she proved that fact. When she was either in her late teens or early 20s, she went to the big city, Chicago, by herself, which was really a no-no. But more than that, she enrolled in a school for chiropractics. And that was simply unheard of. And she was fairly deeply criticized by some of the family members and other people. But it didn't matter to her. That's what she wanted to do. So she did it. And she got her license to practice. And she practiced for a few years. And then was married. And then the children, Troy and Carol, and then later me, came along. But she still practiced in her home. And she practiced until 1944, when they moved to Big Rapids. And after that, I don't believe she gave treatments anymore. So that was one thing she did. When after they were married and after the war was over, well, during the war, I should say, they moved to Constantine, Michigan, on the Fox Farm, and this was in the 30s, it must have been. And during that time, the Depression came along, but we had a cow, always had a cow, so we had milk and all the dairy products, usually raised a pig, and then butchered it in the fall and had all the pork. And Mother had chickens, and then they usually bought either a quarter or a half of beef. And Mother would can all that meat, make the hams and hang them out on the porch of the feed house and let them cure. But otherwise she cooked and canned the meat. We had 3 huge gardens, which I had to weed, and I hate gardening up to this day. And so we had all the vegetables. They would last us all winter, but of course we canned all winter. Well, a wonderful thing happened. The freezer locker came to town, and they could rent a locker, and we didn't have to can and all that stuff anymore. We still canned the vegetables, but the meat could go into the locker. That was wonderful. And then a few years later, they got a refrigerator, and that was another great thing. It had a little freezer on the top. So those were 2 big events. Well, during all that time, then the war came along, and during the war, my mother did another adventure that was a little unusual, I thought. She hauled mobile homes across the country, delivered mobile homes. We had a 41 Plymouth, and they put overload springs on it. And she'd hook up to one of these huge homes, take off some state way out west or south or somewhere, all by herself. And I look back at that and I think, boy, she had a lot of nerve. She was really a remarkable person. And I could go on, but I think that gives you a pretty fair idea. Another thing about my mother that I've really carried with me, we never could say, I can't, at our house. I learned very early on, you don't ever say, I can't. Because Mother would say, why can't you? I'd say, I don't know how. Well, then you better find out how. And that was like waving a red flag in front of my mother to say, I can't. That was not acceptable in her belief. And she lived her life like that. If she chose to do something, she would find a way to do it. She was very much interested that all three of us went to college. And of course, they didn't have any money. It was poor times. And, but she found a way. My brother got a scholarship with ROTC. And then when he was through college, he was automatically commissioned to the Air Force. And he trained on B-52 bombers until they were just ready to go overseas when the war ended. My sister, Jerry's mother, went to Elkhart Business School, and she could do that by living with Emma, who was Laura's daughter. At the time it was time for me to go to college, my parents had moved, and I with them, to Big Rapids, Michigan. And Ferris State College is located there. So I was able to go to college by staying at home and commuting. And they managed to scrape up the tuition for me. So I've learned several things from my mother, but another thing is that you don't have to be, even if you're poor, you don't have to be poor. I mean, that sounds silly, but if you don't have a lot of money, it doesn't matter. You can still find ways to do what you want to do.
When I was a youngster, I used to love to go up and stay with Aunt Fanny and Shelley, and I enjoyed it because I was an only child. And when I was there, I had the opportunity to play with other kids. And I remember getting out on the road and playing kick the can and doing a lot of things that I didn't get to do at home. And one of the things that I recall was going mushroom hunting with my aunt. Across the street from where they lived, there was an orchard. And we got into the orchard looking for mushrooms, but what we found was a snake. And it was, at that time, it was a good-sized snake because it scared me to death. Well, Aunt Fanny said to come with her to the neighbors where she was going, but I didn't, of course. I turned around and went back to their house. Well, I got into the house and looked around, and my Aunt Fanny wasn't with me. I was scared to death because I was sure the snake had gotten her. Well, a little bit later she came, and by then I was crying, and she said, well, it's your fault. You didn't pay attention. You didn't do what I told you to do. And I did have a good time there, but I did learn that if Aunt Fanny said something that I was to do, I was to do it. My other thing was that I loved at their place, along with the baby foxes, was the fact that they had these white cats. They were 7-toed. And they, of course, had little kittens, which I like to take home with me, too. So I have a lot of fond memories, particularly of Constantine, Michigan. But when they moved to Big Rapids, Michigan, my cousin David Harriet's brother, was there working for the summer with them. And of course, they had horse meat to feed the foxes. Well, one day we sat down to dinner, and I thought it was a little bit strange. There was a meatloaf on this end of the table, and there was a meatloaf on that end of the table. Well, my mother and dad and I proceeded to eat meatloaf, and it was very good. Only to find out that David had mixed up the horse meat for the meatloaf that was at our end of the table. And meanwhile, he was chuckling up a storm. But I do have a lot of fond memories of being with them. And when Harriet mentions Ferris State, when I went to college, I didn't want to go. I wanted to, at that time. Well, I finally said, okay, if I can go to school at Ferris State, I will go. Well, it didn't work out. I wound up at another college, but I wanted to be where Shelley was, and I guess they thought we'd get into too much trouble together, so we didn't get to do it.
The only thing I remember about her, did you ever hear of St. Vitus dance? Well, I was supposed to have that, and my folks sent me to Aunt Fanny to get a treatment. And I don't know whether the rest, I don't know how often I went or anything like that.
Okay. Well, I want to echo a lot of what people have talked about my grandmother, Fanny. I spent summers with her, many summers with her. My mother worked, and rather than have a babysitter, I was sent, or always wanted to go stay with my grandmother. We lived in the southwestern corner of Michigan in a town called Niles, and they lived in Big Rapids, Michigan, and it was maybe 4-hour drive, 3-4-hour drive. And those days it wasn't, you just didn't hop in the car or get in the plane or whatever and go. When you went, stayed, and then at the end of the summer came home. So she was really a terrific lady to me and quite a role model. She was very resourceful, creative, and I don't know who said it, but when she said you would do something, you did it. There wasn't any back talk or, I'm not going to do it. And to give one example how resourceful she was, I believe it was when they were moving, she and my grandfather were moving from Big Rapids, Michigan to Middlebury, Indiana, where my great aunt Olive had a motel, and they were going to come and help her run the motel. But I was about 10, and we were driving and, talking, and just my grandmother and myself in the car. I don't know why my grandfather wasn't there. But she got pulled over for speeding. There were almost no other cars on the road. And the policeman, I go, oh, policeman, those days you were really afraid of policemen, or what is he going to do, and, what if he takes the car away or something. So I had all these visions of us not getting to where we were going. So anyhow, he asked her for her driver's license, and she happened to have just gotten a new driver's license in the mail, and she had it in the console between the seats, and it wasn't opened. So the letter wasn't open, so she handed it to him, and he opened it. And he said, well, but you were speeding. And she said to the policeman, you opened my mail, and that's illegal. You're not supposed to open my mail. And he gave her the license back and said, go on. That's just one story of things that she did. So, and I said, I really loved spending the summers with her. They did raise, this was in Big Rapids, Michigan, they did raise fox and mink. They had chickens. To this day, I never want to raise chickens. I had to go out to that hen house and get those eggs and those things. I thought they smelled, but anyhow, urban chicken raising is now a big thing, but I certainly don't want to do it. And she used to take those chickens and just wring their neck and hang them up on the clothesline, let the blood drip, and then defeather them, cook however she did it. I mean, that was nothing for her to do. She also had a tree stump where the tree had been cut down, and she used that too for a chopping block for chickens and whatever else. I don't mind gardening, but as a 9 and 10-year-old, it wasn't my favorite thing to go out and weed and hoe and so on. But we had to do it. So I saw this flat snake. It was blue and gold in the garden, and I just ran the other way. And she thought, well, you silly child. Why are you running away? It's just a snake. And she just picked it up on a pole and slung it off, into the side. And I went, I think could bite, and but of course it didn't. But anyhow, that's just the way she was. She also, as my aunt said, believed in education, and she believed that everyone should get an education. And I was aware that she was a chiropractor. In fact, I can remember as a child getting treatments from her on rare occasion. I also thought she went to Ohio and got a degree to be a naturopath. I remember seeing a certificate for that somewhere, but I can't confirm that entirely. And I do remember my mother saying that people used to come to the house for treatments when my mother was young. I also have, and I believe my brother has them, some letters that she and my grandfather exchanged when she went to school in Chicago, which was just, unheard of them for a girl to go away and go to school, about, it must have been before they were married, and about what they were going to do when they got married and so on. And I actually will go ahead and look for those letters. I don't remember much about family reunions. We did, like Barbara said, on Sundays we would go visiting relatives, and often it was my grandparents when they lived in Middlebury, Indiana, that we went to visit. And I became very close to my grandmother over the years. She died in the early 1980s. She would never say when she was born because she wanted people to think she was younger than she was. So I, to this day, do not know when she was born. Someone else here may know. Someone else is shaking their head that yes, they do know and could probably state that. Again, she was a tremendous influence on me, getting educated, believing that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And here she was, had a profession, raised children. And also her religious beliefs were very important to her. Her belief in God was very important, and she instilled that in me also. I remember every day she would read these daily, like the Upper Room and the daily book, religious booklets. And one thing I do remember about world events, she told me one time we used to cut up old clothes that were rags into small strips and sew them together and roll them in a ball, and then she would weave them into a carpet. They were called carpet rags. And there was an old apron or something that had things that looked like a half sun on them. And she said, during World War II, when her son Troy was trained to be a pilot, he saw her with that apron. And he said, that looks like the rising sun from Japan. And she never wore the apron after that. And she put it away and then was cutting it up for carpet rags. So her beliefs were very strong, and her ability to do things was quite tremendous. And I do remember she was alone quite a while after my grandfather died, and then she also came to Greencroft community, and she died when she was here.
Well, I also have some good memories of Aunt Fanny and Uncle Dennis, and I guess that the missing digits was a continuing thread through my life, because not only did Uncle Ed have a missing finger, Aunt Fanny was missing 2 fingers. And she had gotten them caught in the meat grinder for the horse meat, to grind up the horse meat for the fox feed. And I have to digress just a little, because I don't know if any of the rest of you wondered how in the world they ever ended up being fox farmers and mink farmers. And that story is connected with my dad. And I really do believe that there must be a Troyer gene that involves adventure and being just a little cut above the ordinary. Because when my dad was in college at Bluffton College in Bluffton, Ohio, this was at a period in time when it was before the Depression, but the world was kind of topsy-turvy, and there were a lot of strange businesses started, and among them there was a group of people that were actually college professors at Bluffton College in Bluffton, Ohio, who decided that raising foxes would be a lucrative business. I have no idea how my dad got hooked into that thing, but he did, and he convinced Aunt Fanny and Uncle Dennis that they should raise foxes and mink for profit, because fox skin and mink skin, mink pelts were selling at a good price. I don't have any idea of the details, obviously, of this, but somehow or other, Aunt Fanny and Uncle Dennis ended up raising foxes. And we, again, would visit them, not necessarily on a Sunday, because my memories were when they lived in Big Rapids, Michigan, but we visited them sometimes on our way to and from fishing trips in Ontario, Canada. And my greatest pleasure in life was getting to go out and help feed the foxes. And Uncle Dennis used a great big wheelbarrow, and he made the horse meat into round balls and then would put it into the pens, and the foxes smelled atrocious, but I absolutely loved seeing them because they were just very interesting, and I would tag along with him when he would feed the foxes. And I recall that Aunt Fanny had a great sense of humor, and she and Dad would laugh, and then sometimes it went to Dutch and I didn't know what they were saying, but I also recall that when she spoke, you really did listen to what she said, and there wasn't any questioning about, well, why. You just did things. And I enjoyed knowing both of them, and I always felt that she was a very, very dignified kind of person. I just always, she had this sort of aura of dignity about her, so that's my memory of that.
Well, I too remember when Uncle Dennis and Aunt Fanny lived in Big Rapids, Michigan, and my brother and I were always excited to go up there to see the foxes, to see the mink, and get to go out and watch them being fed. I don't think we were allowed to help feed them. They lived in a stone house, which was very unusual because, and it still stands there. I have been by it in recent years. The other thing that really strikes me, they were quite the card players, and my parents and they would play cards constantly when we were there. The other thing, several different years, we got together with some of the aunts and uncles for a family week somewhere at a lake. It always involved fishing, and usually a place that had chipmunks around that I could watch. But one of my favorite memories was the evening men had caught the fish, brought them in, and they were fixing them for supper. Aunt Fanny shook them up in the bag, and they fried them, and they put them out on the table. And my brother took a bite and said, "Ugh." And she had put sugar in the bag instead of flour. Oh. So we had to throw the fish out, unfortunately, because at that point most people didn't throw food away. You ate what you had, but nobody could stomach sugared fish.
I just thought of a couple more things. One of the other reasons why I like going to stay with my grandmother in the summertime is that my Aunt Shelley and her family lived near, and I could play with her children. We're still friends today, my cousins. And it just always was very relaxing and fun, and there was a lot of outdoors and, places to go, which probably as an adult, wouldn't look big, but there was a lot of woods and, open area and so on. And I too remember this stone house, and I actually remember on the front, I think it did not have stones when they bought it, and I can remember seeing the men rolling these big boulders. These are not small stones. They were large, very large stones in this house, rolling them up to the front of the house and cementing them into the house. And also with the fox and mink, as the others had said, I was fascinated with them. But one time I just leaned on the cage and my index finger went into the cage. They were like barbed wire or wire mesh for the cages, so they had little holes in them. And that fox or mink jumped up and bit my index finger and bit right through it, a clean hole right through my index finger. And, then you just didn't run off to the doctor or the hospital, and my grandmother bandaged it up, and that was it. It healed, and I can't even tell where it is today.